So again, coming out of like Cronin, there's this English logic of ordering space and of reconceptualizing space as owned. The Dutch logic of oystering, so most of the oyster workers, both in the shanties and who would later become owners of the means of production in the oystering industry, come from this area of Holland called Zeeland. It's like a coastal area, and oystering had been done there for a long time. And also French innovations in oyster cultivation. So the French developed this technical means by which they would like put ceramic plates underwater, and they learned how to take small baby-like seed oysters and grow them into full-size marketable oysters. So all of these different ways of thinking about the oyster and about thinking about land all kind of come together in the Great South Bay. So bundle 3 is where the majority of our study focused. This is still like a work in progress, but it started here, and we're like expanding out to all these bundles. So this is where the majority of what we looked at came from. So the first big thing with bundle 3 was the enclosure of land. So the Great South Bay, the image on the bottom right is also a different image of the Great South Bay. So there's two like big towns, and the way of governing on Long Island is like by like the town. They're almost like county sized. They're like these huge towns comprised of all these little villages and stuff. So there was Islip and Brookhaven. Islip generally is what you see on like the western or like the left part of the map, and then Brookhaven's more towards the right. So those dark splotches are public use oyster beds. So they aren't owned. They're not. There's no like private ownership of those. And we kind of lost the detail on the scan from the book, but there are like these big outlines that are privately controlled oyster beds. So Islip and Brookhaven, to raise revenue, they would lease out plots of the bay for people. So you had to pay, and you would get a plot of like oystering land. Now that's important because in order to grow and cultivate oysters on an industrial scale, you need to actually like control the land that you're oystering on. So coupled with that is this like process of proletarianization. So initially in like bundles 1 and 2, they were what were called independent baymen who would go out, they would take out oysters from the naturally occurring beds. Once these areas became enclosed and owned, the main component of labor actually went into what were called like oyster shanties, and they were these buildings where you would chuck oysters for like pennies for a day. There were also a number of technological shifts that occurred during this like commodification and industrialization period. The Long Island Railroad was a big one. With the railroad was brought to the South Shore of Long Island to transport oysters to New York City, the major population center. Steam and oil become important here. There were steam-powered oystering boats, oil-powered oystering boats, and dredging also becomes important, like actually scraping the bottom of the bay floor instead of like picking them up with tongs by hand. So we also see here the appropriation of like unpaid work and energy. So the naturally occurring beds to the right of the map are where like the little seed oysters grow. And that's like a free gift of nature. Laborers would go and like take those seed oysters and bring them to the privatized, commodified plots in the western part of the Great South Bay. And then we see, so women before they were married would go to work in like the oyster shanties. But after they were married, they were brought into the home where they would do all of the unpaid domestic work, raising kids, doing the laundry, cooking, cleaning, all of that. So we start to see as oyster production shifts to like true commodity production, costs rise. So there's an increased amount of capitalization in oyster production. Labor unrest ensues. They struck multiple times in 1901, 1922, 1937, asking for higher wages, shorter working days, better working conditions. And we also see like a corporate consolidation. So that bucket thing up there is a seal-shipped oyster like transportation device. So seal-shipped bought up all of the land in the Great South Bay. They developed this like technical piece of equipment where you could ship oysters and pack them around the world. So we start to see an increase in capitalization coupled with a decline in ecological surplus, where the oyster is really branded and commodified and sold on a large scale, so it becomes more cost intensive to produce oysters. So they're producing more oysters, but it's more costly to produce those oysters. And then the ecological surplus also starts to decline because of a number of things, so that we kind of get to like the end of cheap nature in the Great South Bay. So a number of human and extra-human factors go into the decline of the Great South Bay. So there was a hurricane in 1938 that opened up new inlets in the bay. That increased the salinity of the water in the bay, which it wasn't good for oysters. It also, predators who could survive in that like increased salinity of the water would come that would eat oysters. There were runoffs from pollution, so with the oystering industry came the railroad, obviously, which brought pollution, brought more population. From the mid-1800s to like 1901, 1902, the population of a town of Sayville, which was like the main center of production, it doubled, went from about 600 people to 1,200 people in like 40 years. So there's like more pollution from the oystering industry, so it's kind of this co-productive, the industry is kind of running itself into the ground. There's also over-harvesting of the natural oyster beds on like the eastern side of the bay that I showed you before. Dredging has terrible ecological impacts for the bottom of the bay, so it kind of spelled doom for oystering in the Great South Bay for a long time. So bundle 5 is like a frontier shift, so capital needs to find new frontiers of cheap nature to appropriate. So it shifts to China in the 1980s. So that's that graphic down there. So China is currently the largest producer of oysters. They have a lot of conditions similar to turn of the 20th century Long Island. So it's a major production center. They had like a proletarianized workforce, a lot of land to underwater land to produce these oysters. So we see a shift in the frontier to China, and this is still going on. They're still like the major oyster producer today. And then so this new bundle is this sort of like boutique production of oysters, and this started less than 10 years ago. So there's a new oyster company in Sayville, in the same like area that the oysters were produced. It's called Blue Island Oyster Company. So there is a small scale production. It's more of like it's like a local, sustainable, it's branded to people as these oysters are gonna filter out the bay and clean up the bay. They say that they're good for storm barriers, and it's really marketed to like upper class. It's like a luxury good. So it's returned, but not on this industrial scale. And the bay probably couldn't handle industrial scale oystering anymore because of those human and extra human problems with the bay. So this kind of serves as like a case study showing that a lot of these world ecological perspectives have a lot of currency, and they're really useful in kind of retelling and re-explaining those stories. So you can start out with like the story your grandpa tells you, and it really is a much more complex and interesting story when looked at from a world ecological perspective. So yeah, that's it.
So we'll have the question and answer sessions. So I will ask Kristen, John, and John. Ben.
Do we have one more paper?
No, it's both by John and
No,
yeah.
wasn't Alyssa talking now? No? Were you talking?
I thought so, but
Yeah, you're up.
Oh.
Yeah, she's up now.
Oh, all right, sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's our fault for we didn't tell we went.
Oh, right,
Here.
yeah, I didn't.
We told Alyssa and we told each other,
yeah,
but we
supposed
didn't
to
tell
be
you.
yesterday. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
No, their car trouble was involved.
All right, so we'll have the fourth presenter, Alyssa, and let me see, your title is still, I have it here, just a moment. Supposed to be, political subjects and solidarity in the web of life. Okay, so the time is yours.
Great. I will try to go quickly since I know we don't have are trying to fit for talks in. And so I am a political theorist, and so I'm trying to think of some of the themes of this conference and the work people are doing here in relation to politics. And so specifically, I'm trying to think about the question of the political subject, and specifically the question of the subject of the proletariat, which of course is the political subject for Marxists, and how that figure might change from a perspective that's trying to incorporate ecology and some from a world ecological perspective. And so the political theorist William Clare Roberts observes that the operation of categorizing as forms of production activities not traditionally understood as such provokes a mutation in the categorical features of production itself. This reconstitution of the category production/labor in turn transforms the Marxist conception of the worker, and since the class of workers is Marxism's revolutionary agency, the reconstitution of labor necessarily redounds to transfigure the revolutionary project itself. And so the theme of this conference and what we're thinking about here, Women, Nature, Colonies, is obviously trying to deal with the first part of this argument that the sort of categorization of forms of production or activities that aren't traditionally understood as such, looking at unpaid labor, unpaid work, or forms of work that may not fit into traditional forms of production. And so, and to some extent, the transformation of the concept of the worker that comes with that, and how we might rethink who and where we find workers with a sort of Misesian concept of the unpaid work delivered by women, nature, and colonies. And so I am trying to think through a little bit both that question, but then also what that would do for the transformation of our understanding of the political subject and how we constitute that. And so the two elements of the sort of women, nature, colonies part seem fairly straightforward, at least in theory, if not in practice, and the way that people are starting to think about have identified the work that people doing things like care work, social reproduction, the unpaid labor of the household, and so on, predominantly women, but not exclusively, thinking through that kind of so I guess like the women, whether or not they're actually women or identified as women or so on, doing feminized labor, social reproduction, and how both that kind of work is both being brought commodified, brought into the realm of wage labor, but also organized. The sort of both the question of cheap labor provided largely in the global south, but also large surplus populations, both in the global south and in communities in the global north, usually racialized communities in the global north. And so those kinds of subjects and populations have been, I think, analyzed and discussed by other commentators. So you have a lot of people working on these questions. And so what I want to talk about a little bit here is what do we do with this last part, nature? What does that do if you have a read of as Jason puts it, of work energy as part of this unpaid work? Does nature have a place to play in the sort of political subject, the reconstitution of the political subject? And if so, how? And so I am going to just talk briefly about a few different ways that people have tried to start thinking about, I think, extending some sort of question of political, extending both the concept of nature as providing some kind of labor, but also more specifically ways that people have tried to think through whether there's any political potential in that, and some of the limitations of it, and potentially possibilities. I am very interested to hear what people think of this, because I have a lot of skepticism about some of the things that have been put forth so far, but I think that there might be some interesting stuff to explore. So I think the reasons that we would want to think through this is, one is, if we're thinking about the world through this kind of ecological perspective, and particularly world ecological perspective, we're going to need to look to new sites and subjects of political action. And many of the papers at this conference have demonstrated that really well, but I think it's also important to be trying to avoid some of the directions that Marxists or left political theorists have taken in the past when confronted either with the failure of the proletariat to act as they think it will, or when considering how Marxism can intersect with ecology, or facing some limitations of traditional Marxist theories regarding ecology. So you have sort of Frankfurt School theories, in particular Adorno and Horkheimer, who turn away from theorizing really like political subjects, lose faith in the proletariat, and instead kind of turn away from class struggle and towards the struggle of man versus nature in a way that kind of mirrors, I think, a lot of, or maybe doesn't mirror, precedes, obviously, some of the kind of discussion you see around the Anthropocene, where it's man and nature are the main categories. On the other hand, you have somebody like Rudolf Barrow, who, socialist, who, as he takes up green perspectives, declares that the proletariat can no longer be, an agent for humanity in general, and goes so far as to say that the working class is the worst exploiting class in history, and has a very negative view of the potential of sort of traditional working class movements. And so I think it seems important to think how you could more seriously consider relationships to nature and the exploitation of nature without losing that class perspective. So there are a lot of ways into that, including thinking about the ways that human labor and care feature in ecological reproduction, the ways that that forms of human labor that go into making a life for human that requires less appropriation of or commodification of nature. And also thinking about where and how what Jason calls socialist valuations of nature are occurring. So Silvia Federici has taken up an advocacy of commoning. Jason finds promise in food sovereignty struggles. So there are many ways that you could think about ecology or ecological perspectives within a Marxist analysis or some kind of socialist perspective. But again, to turn to the question of the work of nature itself, what would you do to think through this question of the work of nature and how it might fit into the work of nature on those terms rather than as a resource or something like that. So the three approaches that I'm going to talk about briefly are those advanced recently by Timothy Morton, Donna Haraway, and Sunara Taylor. And so there have been, a lot of different attempts to sort of think about what some kind of thinking about potentially solidarity with non-humans might be, including from the Frankfurt scholar Alfred Schmidt, who suggests that maybe under socialism, humans will learn to practice solidarity with the oppressed animal world, but doesn't really say much about it. But so there's been some recent work. So Timothy Morton's book, Humankind, which is, I think, not quite out yet, but proposes to take up the question of solidarity with what he calls non-human people as his primary topic. And he's a philosopher who's coming out of the sort of object-oriented ontology world, and is now saying that Marxism needs to take up ecology and think about human, non-human relationships in terms of solidarity. For him, solidarity is, quote, the word to describe a reliance between discrete yet deeply interrelated beings, a word that describes a state of physical and political organization and that describes a feeling. He argues that humans, quote, humans can achieve solidarity among themselves and between themselves and other beings because solidarity is the default effective environment of the top layers of the Earth's crust. And since solidarity is so cheap and default, it extends to non-humans automatically. And he goes on, in other parts, he wants to reject what he calls the Great Severing, which I think is his account of a Cartesian dualism. So he has a view of rejecting a Cartesian dualism and taking up some kind of different relationship to non-humans, but he really doesn't articulate more what this solidarity is and has, I think, takes up what you see a lot in recent work on thinking about non-human relationships, which is a sort of just recognition of general interdependence that's rooted in some very basic biological co-production and has very little sense of political action. It kind of just boils down to this sense of, well, we're all connected in the web of life, and so we all have solidarity in the web of life, and that's it. There's no sense of actually, an actual political collective, and antagonisms, divisions, how certain humans and non-humans might be oriented against others. So it feels very apolitical to me. I find more political promise in Donna Haraway's Cyborg. So the cyborg is the figure that comes out of her reading of the post-Fordist economy, and has a model of an oppositional subject that's collective but partial and multitudinous, and tries to cross boundaries between human and machine, between human and animal, between organism and machine. And so it's trying to bring together some kind of subject that's not constituted by an essentialized definition, and that's open to change and expansive enough to encompass the range of human experience in different permutations, and also possibly more than human experience. So she said that her ultimate view of cyborgness is her realization of, quote, how like a leaf I am. So thinking about not only biological similarities, but the ways that the production of scientific knowledge has made it possible for her to come to know that she has similarities to a leaf, and what that might make possible in terms of relationships. And yet, the more she writes specifically on relationships with non-humans, the more she also feels to be moving away from a political conception of collectivity. So when she writes about her book about relationships to mostly to dogs, is about companion species, but she describes companion species as naming a deep entanglement of humans and other kinds of bodies. It's very much grounded in her own experiences and relations, but this view of relationships seems to mostly describe kind of relations of symbiosis, which, as she describes mostly in her most recent book, Staying with the Trouble, she calls it sympoiesis, meaning making with, and is a relationship of, again, necessarily collective co-production, which is, again, feels, it's not really grounded in a sort of specific historical, political, or economic situation. It's just simple biological necessity and ongoing co-making. And I think that where she ends up with that is her attempt, or her proposal for cultivating greater, different relationships with non-humans ends up being this very biologically oriented notion of kinship, where she proposes genetically altering humans to be